The experiment governments couldn't stop. At first, it looked like a technical curiosity, too small to matter, too strange to threaten anything real. Then it kept spreading, not through campaigns, not through force, but through quiet adoption. To understand why governments struggled to respond, we have to understand what they were facing. Not a company, not a country, not a movement with leaders to negotiate with. This was an experiment without a center. Every government system relies on leverage, licenses, borders, institutions, pressure points that can be controlled. This experiment offered none. There was no headquarters to raid, no CEO to subpoena, no office to shut down, only software running wherever people chose to run it. Early reactions were dismissive. Regulators called it irrelevant. Politicians called it dangerous. Most assumed it would fade on its own, but it didn't. Each attempt to restrict it created workarounds. Each ban pushed activity elsewhere. Each warning sparked curiosity. Control requires visibility. The system thrived on distribution. Even when access points were targeted, the core kept functioning. Nodes appeared in new jurisdictions. Developers adapted. Users learned to route around obstacles. The experiment wasn't resisting authority. It was ignoring it. That indifference changed the dynamic completely. Power only works when it's acknowledged. This system refused to acknowledge it. And for the first time, governments faced a financial network that didn't need their permission to exist. That realization marked a turning point, not just for policy, but for sovereignty itself. Because if money can operate beyond borders, what does control really mean anymore? The answer was still unfolding, and it would force every authority to rethink how power actually works. Initial responses focused on containment. Warnings were issued, guidelines were drafted, agencies debated jurisdiction and responsibility. But containment assumed something fixed, something that could be boxed in. This experiment refused that assumption. When one country restricted access, activity migrated. When platforms were shut down, new ones emerged. When on-ramps closed, peer-to-peer alternatives filled the gap. The system adapted faster than policy cycles, not because it was smarter, but because it was decentralized. Governments are designed for stability. Change moves through committees, approvals, deliberation. This network moved through code, iteration, consensus. The mismatch became obvious. By the time regulations were written, the system had already evolved. Some authorities tried cooperation, licensing exchanges, tax frameworks, disclosure requirements, attempts to integrate the experiment into existing structures. Others chose confrontation, outright bans, criminal penalties, public campaigns warning of danger. Neither approach stopped it, because the core wasn't a business. It wasn't a service. It was an idea executed by software. Shutting it down required global coordination, perfect enforcement, and universal agreement. None of those conditions existed. Even surveillance had limits. Transactions were visible, but identities weren't always clear. Control depended on endpoints, and endpoints kept shifting. The more pressure applied, the more the system revealed its strength. It didn't break. It fragmented. And fragmentation made it harder to suppress. This forced a realization inside policy circles. They weren't regulating a product. They were negotiating with a protocol. And protocols don't compromise. They only execute. That realization marked the beginning of a new phase, one where governments stopped asking how to stop it and started asking how to live with it. As coexistence replaced confrontation, strategies shifted again, from suppression to adaptation. Governments began experimenting. Some explored digital currencies of their own. Others studied how to apply oversight without control. A few tried to replicate decentralization while retaining authority. These efforts revealed a paradox. You can imitate the technology, but you can't copy the philosophy without surrendering power. Decentralization isn't a feature. It's a choice, one that limits discretion by design. Attempts to centralize the experiment stripped away its advantages. Control reintroduced fragility. Permission slowed innovation. Trust required belief again. Still, the influence was undeniable. Even skeptics adopted the language. Transparency, immutability, auditability, concepts once dismissed as fringe, entered mainstream policy discussions. The experiment had reframed expectations. Citizens began asking new questions. Why are transfers delayed? Why are systems opaque? Why does access depend on approval? These questions weren't ideological. They were practical. Comparison had changed standards. The presence of an alternative made shortcomings visible. Systems once accepted by default were now judged against a different benchmark. This didn't weaken governments. It challenged them to evolve. Some embraced the pressure. They modernized infrastructure, improved efficiency, increased transparency. Others resisted, clinging to control, doubling down on enforcement, framing the experiment as a threat. Both responses acknowledged the same truth. The experiment could not be erased. It had become a permanent variable, one that reshaped incentives and redefined what authority could realistically enforce. The question was no longer whether it would survive. It was how deeply it would integrate into the world it had disrupted. The conclusion arrived quietly, not through defeat, but through acceptance. Governments didn't lose control overnight. They lost exclusivity. Money was no longer theirs alone to define. The experiment didn't overthrow authority. It exposed its limits. Borders mattered less. Gatekeepers mattered less. Permission mattered less. What emerged was not chaos, but negotiation. A new balance between control and coordination. Some governments adapted. They integrated. They regulated edges instead of cores. They accepted what couldn't be changed. Others resisted, and in doing so, accelerated what they feared. Because resistance revealed relevance. The experiment survived not because it was protected, but because it was distributed. Every attempt to stop it proved how difficult stopping it really was. That endurance reshaped perception. If something can't be shut down, it must be reckoned with. If it can be controlled, it must be understood. This didn't end authority. It refined it. Power shifted from enforcement to influence, from command to alignment. The most important outcome wasn't technical. It was psychological. People learned that systems could exist without asking permission, that coordination could emerge without command, that money could operate beyond borders. The experiment governments couldn't stop did something far more disruptive. It proved they weren't the only ones who could build systems that last. And once that proof exists, it never disappears. The deeper lesson wasn't about any single government's response. It was about the nature of control itself. Governments had always assumed that the power to authorize was the same as the power to prevent. If you could grant access, you could withhold it. If you could license something, you could unlicense it. That assumption had held for a long time, because everything that needed authorization was also visible, tangible, located. This experiment broke that equation. The thing that needed no authorization was also the thing that had no location. It existed wherever people chose to run it, and the decision to run it required nothing more than a device and a connection. That combination was impossible to suppress without suppressing the infrastructure on which everything else depended. Governments understood this eventually. The experiment hadn't just evaded control. It had demonstrated the outer limits of what control could realistically accomplish in a networked world, and those limits were far narrower than anyone in a position of authority had previously been willing to admit. Subscribe to join the journey. That admission changed everything downstream, not immediately, not loudly, but in the slow, grinding way that institutional assumptions eventually give way to persistent reality. Policy frameworks began adjusting, not to accommodate the experiment, but to function in a world where the experiment existed. That is a different kind of adjustment, one that doesn't involve winning or losing, only adapting to a constraint that cannot be removed. The experiment governments couldn't stop had done something permanent. It had redefined relationship between what governments can authorize and what humans can build. That gap had always existed. Now it was impossible to ignore, and the policy work of the coming decades will largely consist of governments learning to operate within it, not around it, not over it, within it. That is the real legacy of an experiment. No one could stop the experiment.